Welcome back to Combat Mission, where we're going to take a look at the M4 Sherman. This presents something of a challenge. There are a lot of Sherman variants spread across the 4 World War II games. Those variants have variants, and it's frankly baffling and convoluted trying to catalogue them all. So instead of methodically dealing with every single different Sherman, what I'm going to do in this video is pick apart the M designations that go with them. All the component alphanumeric bits that go into that alphabet soup mean something, and once you find out what they mean, you can understand the difference between something like an M4A1 and an M4A376W. Obviously, a lot of this is going to be relevant outside of Combat Mission, but the focus is on the pointy end. The reliability and ease of maintenance for different types of engine, for example, is of critical importance in the real world, but in games, to the continued benefit of German players, engines just work. This does the M4 something of an injustice, because the design philosophy that created and sustained it was rooted in an appreciation of logistics. There are two intertwined threads to this. The Chieftain covers it all better than I can, go watch him, but here's the quick rundown. First, all vehicles and equipment would have to operate in European or Pacific theatres thousands of miles away from the factories that produce them and their component parts. So everything had to be rugged, it had to be easy to transport, easy to maintain, and easy to replace. Second, that supporting industrial production had to be in significant enough volume to facilitate sustained overseas deployments. Combine these two elements and you emphasise iterative design. Production lines take time to set up and get going, so the US Army wanted components and products that were known to function as required, and it was not prepared to tolerate the production interrupts that experimental parts or radical alterations would entail. Zaloga sums it up by writing, McNair, he's head of Army Ground Forces, defined the two primary requirements of US tank design as battle worthiness and battle need. Battle worthiness demanded sufficient ruggedness and reliability to withstand the rigours of combat service without imposing excessive maintenance. Battle need meant that acquisition was not encouraged unless combat experience had demonstrated both the need for new equipment and that local theatre commanders specifically demanded the new equipment. This does not mean that the Sherman never changed over the course of its life. A 1944 M4A3E8 is recognisably a Sherman, but it's a very different Sherman to the first M4 to roll off the lines in 1942. In fact, the needs of mass production inevitably resulted in some variation. Several different types of engine had to be exploited just to keep up with demand. Inevitably, though, this iterative design philosophy had to collide with German tank design, and the Germans were quite willing to throw new designs into production and suffer through the teething problems, sacrificing mechanical reliability and rate of production for greater firepower and greater protection. Although the M4 was a match for the Panzer IV, the Panther and the Tiger presented a problem that a careful iterative design process was ill-equipped to rapidly solve. To quote Honeycutt, the Sherman's greatest deficiency as far as the European theatre was concerned was its inadequate firepower. Ordnance had recognised this problem early in 1942, and numerous experimental programs were in progress to improve the armament. In the meantime, the troops had to soldier on with what was available. The Americans did bring an upgunned Sherman into service in 1944, and the slightly less scrupulous British somehow jammed the 17-pounder into the turret to create the Firefly, but even then it was still undergunned and under-armoured compared to, for example, the Panther. However, while comparing the technical characteristics of tanks is a good way to gain a quick appreciation of the dynamic between them, the reality is that combat is a team game, and tanks are just a cog in the machine. To quote Zaloga again, the Sherman was part of a well-trained combined arms team fighting alongside determined infantry and supported by superb field artillery and ample tactical air support, operating within the context of more sober tactical decision-making. In the context of industrial warfare, the M4 was ultimately a successful compromise between quality and mass. Almost 50,000 Shermans were produced, supplying not only the US Army but also American allies, and it saw service not only across all theatres but into the post-war period as well. That's a very quick overview of the M4's design background, but it doesn't do much to help identify different variants. So let's kick off with the first component of that M designation. M4 refers to the base design, starting production in July 1942. This is powered by a Wright or Continental R975 engine, allowing the M4 to get up to 24 miles an hour on road. The British refer to this as the Sherman 1. The M4A1, which actually entered production first in February 42, uses a cast upper hull instead of the M4's welded construction. The much more rounded armour doesn't offer any meaningful increase in protection. It actually reduces the internal volume of the tank somewhat and decreases ammunition stowage in the hull. But apart from that, the M4A1, or Sherman 2 to the British, is basically identical to the M4. With both the M4 and M4A1 using the same engine, they have the same rear deck, and it's easy to tell them apart from the other Sherman variants because they're the only one without any grills on it. Starting from 1942, the M4A2 featured a different engine, the General Motors Detroit Diesel 6046D, as part of the effort to increase tank production by sourcing multiple engine types. Most of the M4A2s went to the Lend-Lease program, being supplied to the Soviet Army and to the British Army, where it was known as the Sherman 3. The easiest way to identify it is to look at the rear deck, where there are two grills slightly narrower than the width of the turret bustle. The favoured M4 variant of the US Army, meanwhile, was the M4A3. Built from June 1942 onwards. Again, the big difference is the engine, a Ford GAA V8. Unlike the engines of the other variants, this was actually designed to be a tank engine, and it proved to be the most reliable. In British service it was known as the Sherman 4, but as the US Army's preferred design, production was prioritised for American use and comparatively few M4A3s went into the Lend-Lease program. The best way to tell you're looking at an M4A3 is again to go to the rear deck, where the engine grills are now wider than the turret bustle. Next, from July 1942, we have the M4A4, mounting the monstrosity that is the Chrysler A57 multibank engine. This is actually 5 smaller engines stuck together, and it necessitated a lengthier hull. The US Army never approved the A4 for overseas use, and it mostly saw service with the British as the Sherman 5. Against other M4s, it's easy to tell it apart because it's longer, but without other variants to compare it to, the easiest way is to look for a wide but thin grille on the engine deck right up against the turret. The M4A5, or Grizzly, was essentially an M4 with thicker armour intended for use by the Canadian Army, but production was limited to 188 vehicles and it never really got off the ground. The M4A6 was an attempt to put a multi-fuel Wright G200 engine into the A4. This entered production in October 1943, but was cancelled in February 44 after only 75 tanks had been made. Neither of these last two variants featured in combat mission. The big takeaway here is that the differences between these variants at this level are pretty minor. The designations mostly indicate different engines, and you can expect similar performance out of them. There aren't any tactical considerations you need to bear in mind depending on which variant you're handling. Firepower is something that makes a tactical difference though. We're going to start here by looking at the M4's machine gun armament, because this is the same across almost all the variants. The Sherman is fitted with two 30 caliber M1919 A4s, one mounted in a ball mount in the upper front slope, commonly referred to as the bow machine gun, and the other coaxially with the main gun. There's also a 50 caliber M2 fitted to a pintle mount on the turret. This is not as many machine guns as the original designers wanted, but the two 30 calibers allow the M4 to put down a significant amount of suppressive fire, and the 50 cal gives the tank commander the ability to successfully defeat light German vehicles like half-tracks. An important exception here are the Shermans in British service. The British Army was less enthusiastic about the M2 Browning than the Americans, so British Shermans aren't fitted with it. It was originally intended to function as an anti-aircraft weapon, though obviously the air environment had become so favourable to the Allies by 1944 that it wasn't really needed in that role anymore, but was retained because it was so useful, particularly in allowing the tank commander to engage light targets on his own without having to wait for the main gun. Altogether, the M4 carries upwards of 4,000 rounds of 30 caliber ammunition and 300 rounds of 50 caliber, which is plenty for sustained fire. The main gun, however, is the key component of the M4's firepower. The basic Sherman is armed with a 75mm M3 gun. If the designation doesn't specify a gun type, or it includes 75 in brackets, this is what the tank's primary armament is. In combat mission, we don't know exactly what ammunition is used, but the 75mm M3 can poke holes in the turret of Panzer IVs out to 1500 meters. The front hull is a bit tougher, but still suffers spalling, and by the time the distance has closed to 1000 meters, it's starting to suffer full penetrations. So Sherman 75s can tackle Panzer IVs and German light vehicles like half-tracks without any problems. Heavier armour presents more of an issue. The Panther is essentially impervious to the 75mm M3 from the front at any distance. At point-blank range, spalling to the lower front plate isn't impossible, but if you're that close, something has probably gone wrong somewhere. This doesn't mean that firing on the front of heavy armour isn't worthwhile. Penetrations might not be in the mix, but historically speaking, non-penetrating hits can have tremendous psychological value, and there's always the chance of damaging or destroying all those vital external components like optics and the main gun. The Panther's side armour is a very different proposition. Even out at 1500 meters, the 75mm M3 can poke holes in it, though with potentially limited post-penetration effects. Quantifying the effectiveness of the 75mm high explosive ammunition, on the other hand, is a little more difficult. The M48 HE shell used by the Sherman had 680 grams of TNT filler. Without any reference point, that number is kinda meaningless, but observationally in combat mission it's very effective against infantry in the open. The M4 also has a smoke round available, the M89. This is a base-emitting hexachloroethane type shell, or in other words, a smoke shell rather than a white phosphorus shell. It doesn't instantly generate a cloud of smoke, it takes time to build, and, not that it makes any difference in combat mission because it's not modelled, it doesn't involve the incendiary and extremely hazardous side effects of Willy Pete. Altogether, the M4 has space for 97 main gun rounds. In combat mission, these are split 40 AP, 51 HE and 6 smoke. This is the same across the other base variants with the exception of the M4A1. That rounded cast hull leaves a little bit less room for ammunition and it only carries 90 rounds. Finally, it's worth noting that the Sherman also incorporates power traverse, allowing for faster turret rotation, and a gyro stabilizer, allowing for more accurate fire, or at least the maintenance of a target in the weapon optic, whilst on the move. While these provide not insignificant advantages, it's hard to quantify their usefulness. Some kind of ludicrous situation in which a Sherman is furiously driving in circles around a German tank with slower traverse would be a sign that everyone is involved in some kind of tactical comedy of errors. The 75mm M3 was a perfectly adequate anti-tank weapon against the Panzer IV, and when the Sherman first entered production, this was anticipated to be the mainstay of the German tank fleet. Heavier German tanks were not expected to be encountered with enough frequency to invalidate the Sherman 75. However, while this was generally true for the Tiger, it rapidly became apparent that the Panther was intended to replace the Panzer IV in the medium tank role. Although the Germans never managed this and the Panzer IV stayed in service to the end of the war, there were certainly enough Panthers on the battlefield to focus Allied attention on improving the Sherman's armament. The first of these upgunned Shermans to see service was the British Firefly. This adds a C to the Sherman designation, so a Sherman 3 upgraded to a Firefly would be a Sherman 3C, and it replaced the 75mm M3 with a 17-pounder, a much more effective anti-tank weapon. In terms of numbers, the key statistic to look for kinetic armour penetration is muzzle velocity. So for reference, the muzzle velocity of an M72 AP shell fired from the 75mm M3 is 610 meters a second. The muzzle velocity of the 17-pounders Mark 8 APCBC-T shot was 884 meters a second. significantly higher. Despite this, the Panther's upper front plate is still a difficult prospect for standard AP shots. It can be penetrated, but the lower front plate and sections of the turret face are considerably more vulnerable. The 17-pounder is also capable of firing arm-piercing discarding sabot ammunition that can absolutely go right through that front plate. Historically though, these rounds suffered from some accuracy issues. High-velocity sabot ammunition was relatively new and suffered some teething problems. In combat mission, the TAC AI for the Firefly will only start using APDS inside 500 meters, and even then, not reliably. The easiest way to identify the Firefly is the giant 17-pounder, but there are also some other changes that set it apart. The British really had to mess with the turret interior to fit the 17-pounder in, and the main external indicator of this is the larger turret bustle. This actually contains the radios from the back wall of the turret that would otherwise be crushed by the 17-pounder's recoil, and it also has a counterweight attached to balance out the extra forward weight. Slightly less obviously, the whole bow machine gun has been deleted. This is because the ammunition for the 17-pounder is so large, the assistant driver's position in the front right of the hull has been swapped for ammunition stowage. This allows the Firefly to carry a total of 77 rounds, noticeably less than the Shermans with the 75mm gun, and it's split in combat mission between 46 AP, 5 APDS and 26 high explosive. That extra ammunition storage is valuable, but it also means that the Firefly is down to just the coaxial machine gun. Remember that British Shermans generally don't mount the 50 caliber turret. All this tilts the Firefly very firmly towards an anti-tank role. It can engage infantry targets and provide suppressive fire, but it's not going to be as effective at doing that as the Sherman 75s. Emphasizing this, a quick note on the high explosive shell. Again, effectiveness is somewhat difficult to quantify, but despite the 17-pounder having a larger caliber than the 75 at about 76mm, the 17-pounder HE shells carry much less explosive filler, about 100 grams less. This is because the greater muzzle velocity of the 17-pounder means the shells need to have thicker walls to withstand higher pressures, and there's less internal volume for explosive filler. That combination of less filler and thicker walls should also in theory combine to reduce the fragmentation effect. The American experience of upgunning the M4 highlights the difference in approach. Settling on the 76mm gun M1 and incorporating this into the standard Sherman turret, prototypes arrived at Fort Knox for service tests as early as February 1943, having already passed through the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Armoured Force, however, rejected this first design. According to Honeycutt, the Armoured Force did not agree with the earlier test results. They concluded that the turret arrangement was unsatisfactory mainly because of inadequate space. They pointed out that the tank represented a quick fix design that was improvised from available components in order to achieve rapid production. It wasn't until August 1943 that Armoured Force accepted a modified design with a new turret, and not until January 1944 that Sherman 76s entered production. These are indicated by the number 76 in the designation, so an M4A3 armed with the 76mm gun would be an M4A3 76. Nice and simple. The British designation just adds an A instead. In terms of performance, the numbers for the 76mm gun M1 stand a little below those of the 17-pounder. M79 APT shot, for example, has a muzzle velocity of about 790 meters a second, almost 100 meters a second less than the 17-pounder, but in practical terms this doesn't make a massive amount of difference because they're up against the same thresholds. The 76mm still can't penetrate the upper front hull of the Panther, but can get through the lower front plate and parts of the turret while having no problems with the Panzer IV. This level of penetration obviously still wasn't solving the problem, so the US Army turned to improved ammunition. HVAP, High Velocity Armour Piercing, also known as APCR for Armour Piercing Composite Rigid, arrived in France for testing only in August 1944. HVAP represented an increase in armour penetration and didn't suffer from the sabot problems of the 17-pounder's APDS, but it could still not penetrate the Panther's upper front slope, and due to tungsten carbide shortages and a late start in production, was never available in large numbers. In a similar vein to the 17-pounder, the technical trade-off for increased muzzle velocity was a less effective high explosive round with even less filler, about 408 grams compared to the 680 of the 75. The Sherman 76 did, however, retain its machine guns. 76mm ammunition was larger than 75mm, but not as huge as the 17-pounders, so it wasn't necessary to replace the assistant driver with ammunition stowage, and the bow MG was retained, as well as the pintle-mounted 50. All in all, the Sherman 76 variants carried 71 rounds of main gun ammunition in combat mission that split 28 AP, 39 HE and 4 smoke, potentially with a couple of rounds of HVAP in later periods. The 76 is easily recognisable not just because of the larger gun, which may have a muzzle brake later in the war, but because of the larger turret with its flat-faced gun mantlet. Finally, on the firepower front, we have Shermans replacing the 75mm gun with a 105mm gun, indicated by the addition of 105 in brackets, or the letter B for the British. This alternate armament was actually included in the original design concept, but again, jamming a bigger gun into the turret wasn't a simple task, and production didn't start until February 1944. The 105mm gun M4 was intended to be a HE chucker. A shorter barrel and lower pressure meant that the M1HE shell it fired could be packed with a whopping 2,751 grams of explosive filler, more than 3 times the amount in the 75mm shell. So against infantry buildings and fortifications, Sherman 105s are a lot more effective than Sherman 75s. This comes at the cost of lower muzzle velocity. Slower shells translate into higher trajectories and greater importance in accurate range estimation. It also means that solid armor-piercing shells aren't going to be very effective because they're just not travelling fast enough to penetrate armor to a useful depth. So instead, Sherman 105s also carry high-explosive anti-tank rounds. These use shaped charges in the tip of the shell to create a copper jet that punches through armor, or in other words, armor penetration is not tied to muzzle velocity, and it remains the same at any distance. Again, the Panther's front slope is pretty impenetrable, but there are susceptible weak points on the Panther's front, and the side is fair game, assuming the 105 can actually score a hit with the slower, higher trajectory rounds. 105mm ammunition is the largest we've encountered so far, so the Sherman 105s have a commensurate decrease in ammunition capacity, a maximum load of 66 rounds. In combat mission that split 53 HE, 5 heat and 8 smoke. Sherman 105s are easy to identify because they have a shorter, thicker gun barrel. The next element of the designation we might see is the letter W. This refers to wet stowage, and to explain that, we're going to take a look at the Sherman's armour. In terms of numbers, the front upper hull of base model Shermans is 51mm thick at an angle of 56 degrees. To see what that means, we're going to shoot at it with a Panzer IV and then a Panther. The long 75 on the later Panzer IVs will struggle to penetrate the upper front hull of the M4 at 1500 meters, and it has to close to within 1000 to reliably start scoring partial penetrations. The turret and lower front plate are vulnerable at both these ranges, but in the wider tactical picture, at long ranges it's probably going to take a Panzer IV several shots to get on target, and limiting exposure is going to increase the M4 survivability even more. Inside a kilometre, the Panzer IV can get through the armour, but like we've seen, the M4 can return the favour, so at least in terms of ability to penetrate, it's a fairly even fight. The Panther's 75mm gun, with a greater length of 70 calibers and correspondingly higher muzzle velocity, is much more effective and can easily penetrate the M4's frontal armour even way out of 1500 meters. This is obviously a problem, especially given that even the upgunned Sherman 76s and Fireflies struggle to return the favour, and efforts were made to reduce the M4's vulnerability. While significant changes to the design were not mandated by that iterative design process and the need to maintain volume of production, a limited redesign building off battle experience was started in July 1943, and the results were rolling off the lines by January 44. The two major improvements to the M4 survivability that came out of this were wet stowage and thicker armour. In the earlier design, ammunition was stored in armoured boxes in the hull sponsons and were originally accessible by exterior doors for ease of loading. The doors were quickly deleted and applique armour welded on top, but the ammunition remained where it was, in a position that made the Sherman very vulnerable to ammunition fires. The redesign saw ammunition transferred to new armoured boxes in the floor of the hull, where they were not only lower down and less likely to be hit by rounds or fragments, but the racks of shells were interspersed with water containers that served to reduce the risk of fires. This wet stowage is indicated by a W in the M4's designation and had a very significant impact. According to Zaloga, an army study in 1945 concluded that only 10 to 15% of wet stowage Shermans burned when penetrated, compared to 60 to 80% of the older dry stowage Shermans. A side effect to relocating the ammunition was that more could be carried, an increase of 7 rounds for the main gun to a total of 104, and an extra 2,000 rounds of 30 caliber M2 for the Brownings, with the M4A1 now brought in line with the other variants. In combat mission, it also looks like this upgrade sees the replacement of smoke shells with white phosphorus, which create a smokescreen much faster. At the same time, the M4's armour scheme was improved. The front upper hull was increased to 64mm at 47 degrees, and the distinctive bulges for the two hull crew positions were deleted. Combined with the removal of the applique side armour for the sponsons, this makes upgraded M4s easy to identify. This alteration pushes the effective envelopes of the German guns out a little bit. The Panther can still penetrate the front slope at range, but not as reliably. Partial penetrations are now possible, but the Panzer IV is bouncing off or limited to spalling against the front slope at the 1000 meter mark. Even closer in, at 500 meters, the Panzer IV can't reliably penetrate that front slope. In other words, these are meaningful armour upgrades, though the effects only kick in at longer ranges. So, we've followed the designation up to something like M4A375W. This has all been major stuff, but other changes have been slowly creeping in over time as well, as both production lines are upgraded and individual tanks are refitted. This leads to early, mid and late M4s. Certainly in combat mission, it's a little inconsistent exactly what changes apply to which tanks, so I'm just going to focus on two significant alterations. Outside of that, broadly speaking, the later a Sherman is, the more improvements it's had. The first edition is a smoke launcher, recommended in July 1943 and present in all but the earliest M4s. It's a 2-inch mortar fired through an aperture in the turret roof with 12 smoke bombs. These are smoke rather than white phosphorus, so on top of only being deployable one at a time via the mortar, they don't generate an instant smoke screen. It'll take a little while. The second major addition is a cupola for the commander's position. Earlier Sherman variants have a split hatch for the commander, which has a periscope mounted in it. This has 360 degrees of traverse, but obviously requires the commander to manipulate it. The cupola, on the other hand, features a series of vision blocks around the edge of the hatch and allows the commander to look around by looking around. Basically, the cupola allows much better situational awareness when buttoned up. Finally, the designation might include a letter E followed by a number, though the E8 is frequently referred to as an Easy 8. These indicate experimental tanks and are usually used in developmental work. The Sherman 76 was at one point the E6, for example. The M4A3E2, also known as the Sherman Jumbo, was a much up-armoured M4. When it was clear that what would become the M26 Pershing wouldn't be ready in time for the Allied invasion of France, efforts were made to fill that heavy assault tank role by taking some M4A3s, welding on extra armour and casting a new thicker turret. This resulted in over 100mm of frontal and 76mm of side armour, comparable to the Tiger. Of course, the Tiger didn't have to deal with the same high-velocity German guns, but this is very effective stuff nonetheless. The E2 will bounce AP shells from the Panther as close as 200 meters. There's still spalling and the chance of a shell finding a lucky angle, but that's a significant improvement in armour protection. When the Panther has to maneuver to get a flanking shot on a Sherman, you know you've changed the game. The downside to all that extra protection, of course, is decreased mobility, dropping about 4 miles an hour after the M4A3's top speed of 26. The jumbo is easily identified because of the thicker armour. The bow MG in particular is almost subsumed by extra plating. Production variants were armed with a 75mm gun with an infantry support role in mind, but the turret and gun mantlet were designed to accept both that and the 76, so they were frequently upgunned in the field. The E8 or Easy 8 variant incorporates significant changes to the tracks. The base model Sherman uses a vertical volute spring suspension system, or VVSS. This is easily identifiable by the chunky brackets on the bogies and the use of narrow tracks. The successor to VVSS was HVSS, or horizontal volute spring suspension, which was much more durable, facilitated a smoother ride, and incorporated wider tracks for decreased ground pressure and better cross-country mobility. The wider tracks make it easy to differentiate from VVSS, but the bogie apparatus is also much smaller. Not all Shermans were fitted with HVSS, and not all Shermans that were designated or known as Easy 8s. That would be too simple. In combat mission, some later 76 and 105 armed Shermans can be found with it, but in line with a lot of these improvements, they don't represent a significant inflection point in battlefield capability. Finally, some Shermans were converted to flamethrower tanks using the E4-5 flamethrower. Confusingly, here the E number refers to the flamethrower, not the tank. The weapon itself has a range of about 65 meters and replaces the bow MG. That means that the flame tank retains the use of its entire turret armament, which is obviously quite useful. In combat mission, there are 2 Sherman variants with this weapon: a standard gun tank, the M4A375W E4-5, and an assault tank, which becomes an M4A3E2 75 E4-5, which hopefully makes a lot more sense than it might have done at the start of the video. That then concludes our run through all the little bits that make up the M4 Sherman's M designation. Hopefully it's given you the toolkit to help figure out the tactical implications of that alphabet soup. Once you've got that down, it's a lot easier to get your head around the swarm of Sherman variants. Hope you all enjoyed this one. All these videos are available on Patreon before they hit YouTube, so if you want to see them early, vote on shorts, and take a look behind the scenes, please consider supporting the channel. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.